Everyone would like to live a day in ancient Rome, but at least to find out what he was like for sure. I suggest you an experiment, to live one day in the shoes of the most ordinary people in various ancient cities. Of course, we will start with Rome and focus not on representatives of romantic professions, and on the simplest worker with the most typical life. How do you like this idea, friends? Leave your opinion in the comments, friends. But we are transported to ancient Rome. It is the year 75 AD, and Emperor Vespasian is sitting on the throne. Syria has just become a Roman province, and life after tyranny, Nero, and the Great Fire of Rome 10 years ago finally got better. So much so that Vespasian decided to appease people by building a majestic Colosseum, which will later be called the new wonder of the world. Actually, our main character, Roberto, is working on the construction of the amphitheater. The guy works as an ordinary bricklayer, being a representative of the middle class and a typical resident of Rome. Together with him, we will live one day which will begin right at dawn, 1,500 years before the invention of electricity, and people of antiquity used every minute of daylight to the maximum. Our Roberto will wake up on one of the upper floors of the insula. This was the name of the apartment buildings in which most of the population of ancient Rome lived. Yes, the Romans also had high-rise buildings. They replaced mansions and individual houses back in the days of the Republic, somewhere in the 3rd century BC. Of course, because of the constant increase in the population of Rome. Initially, the number of floors and buildings were chaotic, but over time, the same type of 2- to 4-story houses with small apartments were formed. The upper floors were usually occupied by the poor, while the lower floors were occupied by richer people. The reason is simple. Often the upper floors were built randomly on top of the existing ones, and the water supply and sewerage system almost never reached there. Rome also had a modern habit of placing shops on the ground floors of its high-rise buildings. There were several tens of thousands of insulas in Rome by 150 BC, and they were quite a spectacle. The poor people from the upper floors could easily throw their feces out onto the street. Brawls and stabbings were a common occurrence, and people lived in constant fear in insulae. The lack of a sensible layout and the greed of developers erecting new floors led to the fact that the insula structure and materials could not be called safe. Being largely wooden, they often collapsed, even more often flooded, and very often burned. The apogee was the Great Fire of Rome, which in 64 AD devastated 11 out of the 14 quarters of the city. This was largely due to the dilapidation and close proximity of the buildings to one another. In response, Emperor Nero made the decision to widen the streets in order to keep the insulae further apart. Balconies were also constructed on the upper floors to provide emergency access to them. Later, Emperor Trajan attempted to impose height restrictions on the insulae, but the success of his efforts was limited. But our Roberto was born and lives in a similar insula, and he is definitely not up to high reasoning. Unfortunately, there is no exact data on how the ancient Romans woke up. Although the alarm clock had already been invented, and water clocks existed in ancient Rome, there is no data indicating their widespread use across all social classes. Historians tend to believe that it is we who are lazy in modern times, and our Roberto in ancient Rome had enough buzz to wake up, which began on the street before dawn. There was no sound insulation in the insula, and the screams in the narrow streets woke up better than the infernal alarm clock of a smartphone. And Roberto didn't have much desire to lie on the bed, because there was no bed either. The poor people slept on brick parallelopipeds, on which they laid a mattress stuffed with dried grass. There are many places in books and articles where you can read that the Romans revered food, they had separate dining rooms, and loved family rituals. Unfortunately, this does not particularly apply to ordinary workers. There is nothing in our Roberto's room, and he will run outside to have breakfast. For all classes, the first meal was easy, and we owe the appearance of the famous cherioles to the Roman builders. These are buns, which are the first thing to cook in bakeries at dawn. They were bought up by builders like our Roberto to have a snack on the way to work, just like modern office workers buy coffee at Starbucks. And this is not an exaggeration. because fast food in ancient Rome did not just exist, but was almost more widespread than it is now, but more on that later. In the meantime, our Roberto, after a snack of cherriola with diluted wine, will go to build the Colosseum. The work of a bricklayer has been unchanged for centuries, so we will focus on something else. For example, the fact that the working day in ancient Rome rarely exceeded 6 hours. And with a high probability, our Roberto will be free by lunch. It's quite possible that the next day he won't have to work at all, because the Roman calendar is a fascinating thing. The working week consisted not of 7, but of 8 days. The latter was called nundinae, and was considered a weekend for everyone except merchants. At first glance, everything is worse than it is now, but Roman magic begins here? The guys had a complex system of holidays and work-friendly days. It is still being deciphered, and historians put forward contradictory statements. German scientist Mommsen states that the calendar consisted of 239 days suitable for work. All the others were either unfavorable or so-called black days. This is the anniversary of the catastrophe, military defeats, and bad weather of Rome, in which it was customary to grieve and not to work in any case. But there were still holidays, which the emperors could declare at will. Despite the difference between the different versions of the calendars, almost all scientists agree that on average only 2 out of 3 days were working days. All in all, our Roberto is certainly more rested than we are, and after a 6-hour workday at an average of 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Roberto is already free. The first thing he will almost certainly do is visit the Roman bathhouse. After all, you have not forgotten that the middle class has nothing at home, and hygiene was loved in Rome. Baths were also considered a place of socialization, communication, and leisure. The well-to-do people in front of them were doing sports, but our Roberto has enough sports at work. Perhaps after the bath, he will buy the necessary goods in the markets, which are about to close. Well, after that, Roberto, like the entire population of Rome, regardless of wealth, will be preparing for lunch, the main meal of the day. Started around 4 p.m., and the lunch could last 3 or 4 hours. In wealthy, large families, being a way of unity, but for the poor, entertainment and leisure. After all, they could not arrange dinners at home and return to eat in the eateries. Here we will return to the topic of fast food. The vast majority of the middle and poor class could not afford expensive cooking at home and meals, so the guys gathered in thermopolies. In other words, in eateries. They were essentially no different from modern ones. A marble counter facing the street and heated cauldrons with food, few tables inside, noise, and affordable prices. People either sat down at the counter or occupied the table and had fun besides eating. Not surprising, because the quality of food in Thermopolis was not very good. Being establishments of a low price category, they sold mainly simple stews, olives, fish soups, and very meager analogues of borscht, which, by the way, was the national food of Rome. However, it was mostly vegetable, because the poor saw meat only on holidays. Instead, our Roberto eats boiled beans more often. They perfectly compensated for the lack of protein in the body and were very popular, because health problems from a bad diet among the poor were commonplace. It's possible that Roberto will play craps with one of the neighbors. He would have a couple of glasses of wine and lose part of his paycheck gambling. Also, Thermopolises often staged theatrical mini-performances and hired dancers to placate the public. Ancient Rome is eerily similar to modern Rome. After all, there were advertising signs, frescoes, and even poets in thermopolises who were often heard to invite the public in with poems. Such eateries worked until nightfall, and perhaps Roberto will spend the whole evening there, although there are alternatives. Maybe there are games or gladiator fights somewhere nearby. Perhaps there is a theater production or a speaker's speech nearby. Cultural entertainment has always been very cheap, and everyone could afford it. After all, the emperors are not fools, and understood that the poor would not be a problem as long as he was cheerful and in a good mood. Otherwise, you can get an uprising. Speaking of receiving, Salaries in Rome are wildly difficult to calculate, largely because a huge part of the work was done by slaves, and the emperors reprinted coins in their honor too often. But it is more likely that our Roberto receives about 40 sesterces per month. It takes about 15-20 sesterces per month to rent a tiny apartment, and you need to pay almost every day. Only the rich paid monthly or even once a year, and the cunning landlords preferred to withdraw money from the poor almost daily. This is another reason for fear, because in addition to the destruction of the house, the poor were afraid of eviction. Fortunately, our Roberto is not in danger, and he has about 25 sesterces left for a month. This, in turn, is 100 ass. That is somewhere 3 to 4 per day. For 1 ass, you could buy half a liter of pure wine, 4 trips to the bathhouse, or a kilogram of bread. There is enough for life in general, but Roberto will have to save up for a good tunic. They cost about 15 sesterces, that is, almost like a monthly rent of an apartment. So our Roberto went in. Something simple, and even after buying a beautiful tunic, he did not wear it so often. In general, this is the essence of the life of an ordinary person in ancient Rome. You don't have to starve, because in addition to inexpensive thermopolies, there are also free establishments sponsored by the rich. The food there is worse, but there is no question of starvation, except for health, because the lower classes rarely saw meat, and only the smart ones guessed to replace it with beans. Also, living conditions were not very good, with a constant risk of house collapse or eviction. But on the other hand, there were more than affordable baths, even more affordable entertainment, and even more affordable gladiator fights and games. Is this enough to call the life of ordinary workers of ancient Rome good? It's up to you, and we are waiting for answers in the comments, as well as your feedback and suggestions from other cities where you would like to live one day in ancient times. See you soon, friends.